Hi everyone, this is Rob Darrow from iNACOL welcoming you to our leadership webinar today, a K-12 federal policy framework for competency education, building capacity for systems change. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Maria Worthen and Lillian Pace, who will present the webinar to you today. Just a quick reminder before I turn it over to Maria and Lillian is if you've got questions as the webinar goes on, feel free to type them into the chat room and they'll answer them as they go along. Secondly, know that the webinar is being recorded and that link will be sent out to you tomorrow after the webinar gets recorded. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maria and Lillian.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maria Worthen. I'm the Vice President for Federal and State Policy at iNACOL, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Lillian Pace, Senior Director of National Policy at KnowledgeWorks, to give you our very first webinar on the paper that Lillian and I have co-authored for the Competency Works Initiative. Let me just start before we dive into the substance of the paper. I want to kind of get a temperature check from those of you that are participating in the webinar today. What, in your mind, is the federal government's role in elementary and secondary education? And if you could just take 60 seconds to type a quick reaction to that question into the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen before we proceed with the webinar, that would be great. Again, just want to ask you to type into the chat box, what do you think is the federal role in K-12 education? There's no right or wrong answer. Okay, so funding and minimum standards is one answer that I see. Anyone else? Okay, so Sage says constitutionally there is no federal role in education. James is saying that role of K-12 education is left to the states to determine constitutionally. Provide support for best practices, assist with measures, creating policies that support public schools and teachers, invest in costly research and development, quality education standards. Okay, so that's a really interesting set of questions, and we'll come back to that later. Feel free to keep putting your ideas in. We'll pick up on those in a little bit. So the photo that you see here today is, as you probably know, a famous newspaper photo from the landmark Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education. 2014 is actually the 60th anniversary of that decision, which integrated schools and recognized that separate was not equal. As we know, although integration in schools became a law of the land, in reality, de facto segregation persisted because of the neighborhoods where children lived and economic inequity and inequity of opportunities that persisted. So 11 years later, the federal government took its first step into legislating on K-12 education. Brown versus Board of Education was the first time that there was a decision made that there was some sort of constitutional authority for speaking to opportunity students had in school. And Congress in 1965 passed the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act authorization with the Title I program as its cornerstone. Title I attempted to right the economic inequities that persisted in Brown's wake, but it soon became apparent that funding alone would not close the equity and opportunity gap for disadvantaged students. So with each reauthorization of ESEA, Congress has attempted to figure out ways to identify and close those gaps, and eventually settling on the current accountability structure in the prevailing law of the land No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was passed in 2001, and its authorization expired in 2007. Yet despite 3 attempts to reauthorize it, both in which Lillian and I were both party to when we worked on the Hill, Congress has not yet achieved a compromise on where ESEA is heading next. Where is the federal role in education? In the meantime, the current administration has attempted to move forward with education reforms through the Race to the Top program and through the waivers on NCLB requirements for states. But we have to ask the question, as Congress continues to weigh education reforms, how can the federal government play a role to close achievement gaps and maintain high college and career-ready standards, and providing the right set of levers, or carrots and sticks, as we like to say, to keep the focus on student learning, yet at the same time not incentivize a focus on the wrong things that don't contribute to student learning. So how can the federal government partner with state and local innovators that are moving forward with competency education? So this is the question that Lillian and I have set out to answer in this paper. Just want to level set before we get into the substance of the paper. What we mean when we talk about competency education, we mean that students advance upon mastery, that competencies include explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that empower students. Assessment is meaningful and it's a positive learning experience for students. Students receive timely, differentiated support based on their individual learning needs. And learning outcomes emphasize competencies that include application and creation of knowledge, along with the development of important skills and dispositions. We feel it's important to reiterate this definition because too often, sometimes when we hear people in the field talking about competency education, we only hear them talking about number 1. Learning at your own pace alone is not competency education. It's simply learning at your own pace. And particularly in a system where we want to see equities increase, allowing students to simply learn at their own pace without the supports to keep them moving, to stay on track to college and career readiness, is not an equitable system. Well, this issue is just now coming to the attention of federal policymakers, and we hope even more so with the release of this paper. But states and in particular locals have been moving the ball forward on competency education for quite some time. This is a map that shows where states are in their implementation of competency education in terms of policies that enable a move away from seat time and towards competency. So this brief, a K-12 federal policy framework for competency education, building capacity for system change, is a first report of its kind in terms of being the first report to take a comprehensive look at federal level policies to support competency education for K-12 education. A lot has been, there's been a lot of conversation around what states are doing and what can be done at the district level. But as this concept bubbles up to the federal level, we want to make sure that the conversation is started and that federal policymakers have a chance to think about how the federal government can not require competency education, but support it. So some of the considerations that inform this report, one is timing. As I mentioned, Congress is still wrestling with what a reauthorized ESEA would look like. And we're starting to hear questions from the Hill over the last year or so. Lillian and I have both fielded questions from Hill staff, from the administration, that are saying, we're hearing about this competency education thing. What is it? How can we advance it? So the timing we felt was critical to get this out there as folks start to think about competency education. We wanted to articulate the barriers that exist in the system. I think, very simply put, most of the barriers, the policy barriers, exist at the state level, and yet there are some really, really big systemic barriers outside of the seat time funding and credit accumulation to graduation that are some of the big barriers in states. At the federal level, it's the very architecture of our systems of accountability and assessment and support and data. We want to get folks thinking about how the federal government can support but not inhibit states and districts. So how can they create the right climate for competency education without inadvertently inhibiting innovation? We do identify specific actions that policymakers can take. Sorry, I forgot an S there after policymakers. And gave a couple actions that folks in states can do within the current federal policy climate, as well as what folks at the Department of Education and legislators on the Hill can do to enable a more student-centered accountability system. We felt that it was very important to bring these concepts down to the state and local level to illustrate what's going on. So we have case studies for each of the areas the topical areas that we cover in the paper. And we just want to emphasize that this paper in this webinar and the conversation we're having today is simply the beginning of a conversation. We don't know all the answers at all, but we know that we have to start somewhere. And so we've put our collective heads together to articulate what that starting point is. So student learning should be at the center of any federal accountability system. And that sounds so obvious, and yet we have a system that has not been built 100% around students. We have an accountability system that has largely been built around states and districts and adults. We have assessment systems that are responsive to that accountability system, but not responsive to student learning. We have a system of teacher preparation and professional development that is focused on input-based, highly qualified teacher requirements and state licensure standards. We have the supports and interventions for both students and schools that are disconnected from policy. We have data systems that have been built around meeting compliance requirements, not around supporting students. And we have a system that, although invests a lot of money in research and development and pilot programs, doesn't do a very good job of feeding that data back into improving itself. So this is our framework that we started with. The paper deals with 4 of these areas: accountability, systems of assessment, data systems, and supports and interventions. There are 2 topics that aren't dealt with that will be dealt with at a later date just because they're so big and important in their own right, and that is educator competency and continuous system improvement. So I'm going to go quickly over some of the big ideas in this paper, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lillian to dig into the accountability section for today. So our big idea for accountability is that accountability policies should incent districts, schools, and educators to use real-time, individual student data to tailor instruction, supports, and interventions to ensure that each student is on pace to graduate with mastery of college and career-ready standards and aligned competencies. That is opposed to our current system, where our accountability system, although well-intentioned and attempting to close achievement gaps, is largely built around classifying and sanctioning schools and adults. Our big idea on systems of assessment is that flexible, balanced systems of assessment should measure mastery of competencies aligned to standards prioritizing continuous improvement of student learning to ensure that every student is on pace to graduation. What if, instead of having a single summative end-of-year exam that barely contributes in any way to improving student learning, because most of the time that data is only available after the school year is over, what if we could take the assessments that need to be used for student learning to measure their growth throughout the year and roll up that information at the end of the year, so that those assessments serve the dual purpose of supporting student learning and also meeting accountability requirements. In this way, our systems of assessments would be built around students, not around compliance. Supports and interventions. Now, when we talk about supports and interventions, we talk about it in two ways. We talk about it providing supports and interventions to schools, and we talk about providing supports and interventions to students. Our big idea here is that the federal government should support states and districts in the development and implementation of a proactive system of supports and interventions that uses real-time data to help students advance to college and career readiness through learning experiences aligned to their own personalized learning pathways. In a competency education learning environment, supports and interventions are crucial for students. Students need to have the help they need when they need it on their individual learning trajectory to advance towards college and career readiness. And so we need to be able to pinpoint students before they fall off track and make sure that schools have the support to be able to provide that to them. And let's see, there's a comment here from Chris Sturgis, who was at a meeting with Jennifer Davis from CCSSO the other day, and asked whether teachers can determine proficiency. And there was a silence. Well, everyone considered a system that actually trusted that when a teacher said a student was proficient, that could be aggregated into the accountability system. That's a really good point. And you know, I think that was a huge question in terms of the systems of assessments, is who is building those assessments and how are they being validated against college and career ready benchmark standards, yet at the same time supporting learning and supporting teachers. So thanks for that, Chris. And now, okay, data systems. So our final chapter in the report is about data systems. And our big idea here is that student-centered data systems should help educators customize learning experiences to ensure that every student can master standards and align competencies. If you think about the evolution of computers in schools, the first computer in a school was probably in the principal's office or the principal's secretary's office and was used for data entry or accounting or attendance purposes. From there, you might have gotten one computer on the teacher's desk, again, largely for data entry, maybe some lesson planning. It's only recently that computers and now devices are getting into the hands of students and being a huge key means of supporting their learning. And so our data systems, I think, have been developed in parallel to that, where data systems initially were meant just to support compliance reporting purposes. But now that we have the ability to reach every student through a device or a computer, how can we capture that data and roll it up for our data systems, not have the data systems push down what we should be collecting about students, but collect from students and teachers what is helpful for continuously improving learning. Okay. And before I turn it over to Lillian, I see there's a couple comments from Susan Patrick. There's quite a bit of discussion on allowing teacher assessments to be part of systems of assessments of student performance. That is important, and that was in response to Chris's comment, and that the conversation is important around what comprehensive systems of assessments and multiple measures of accountability, what this can look like for Accountability 3.0. And so when I say that this paper is the beginning of a conversation, I really mean that. We don't have the answers. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered, but we have to start asking those questions and getting them out to the field so that we can identify the answers. So with that, let me turn this over to Lillian, who's going to dig into the accountability piece.
Great, thank you, Maria. And I actually think that Susan's last comment there is an excellent segue into the topic of accountability. It was by design, quite frankly, that we decided to lead with accountability in the topic areas in this paper. We really believe that the accountability issues are at the core of the disconnect between federal policy and competency education. And so I think, as we begin to dig a little deeper into this topic, I think it's important to sort of revisit the question, well, what is the federal role in accountability? Historically, why has the federal government gotten involved in the first place? And I'll offer up a couple of potential reasons, and I think that others on the chat room should certainly feel free to add in. Some of this will align with those you entered in at the beginning of the discussion today. First that I'll mention is sort of this need to have national and international comparisons. How does one state's education system compare to another? What story can the United States tell about its education system when it's looking at other countries and how well we prepare our students to excel in the growing international economy? I think I'd also offer up that there's this idea of building an educated citizenry. The federal government has an obvious self-interest in making sure that citizens are educated enough to support a healthy democracy. And then there's also this running theme, we've heard it mentioned already in the chat box today. I know Maria's alluded to it as well, talking about sort of the federal role in government, is this idea of equity. And I would also throw in there an excellence. The federal government certainly has an interest in removing the disparities in our education system, but also an interest in ensuring that the top performers can succeed. So given those sort of elements for the federal role and accountability, let's dig in a little deeper to really understand the purposes of accountability. When we think about competency education, we think about a traditional system, which would be the current federal system, and then we think about a vision for the future. What would an accountability system look like in a competency-based education system? And so our paper includes a chart, which I encourage you to visit, that essentially has 10 or 11 or so purposes of accountability. I'll flag 3 for this conversation. The first, in the first line there, under our current accountability system, we're really looking at school effectiveness by the percent proficient on annual summative assessments. In an alternate reality, in a competency-based system, we would actually be looking at school effectiveness as measured by a number of multiple measures, looking at growth and pace of learning along learning progressions that indicate building blocks for how students begin to adapt and acquire knowledge. The second line there says that the current system expects schools to get 100% of students to proficient on state standards at the same pace. An alternate vision for that would be that we would expect students to master standards and deeper aligned competencies at a pace to be on track to graduation. So instead of expecting every student to move at the exact same pace, we want them to master deeper content and be on pace to graduate with their peers. And the third line is the current system really has this sort of emphasis on annual after-the-fact data for schools and subgroups of students on state summative assessments. What we really want to see is a system that really drives real-time data on student and subgroup performance, growth, and pace towards mastery of standards and competencies. So Maria made a really great point, and I think if there was one thing that I would hope that everyone would take from this conversation is that, we really believe that competency education is a locally grown movement, that the federal role is really to enable this growth, not to stand in the way. It is not the federal government's responsibility to mandate this. It is not the federal government's responsibility to put an overly complex new system in place. We simply are trying to find a pathway for this movement to continue to grow. And so to that end, I think it's important to start with, looking at where this work is beginning to grow in districts and states across the country. And so our paper includes case studies throughout, one of which is New Hampshire and the work that the state is doing to develop a new vision of accountability 3.0. So I'll start with the reason we chose New Hampshire. New Hampshire was the first state to eliminate the Carnegie unit. The state essentially made a decision that they care a lot more about whether students are proficient, whether they have mastered knowledge and skills in order to succeed, as opposed to how many hours that they've set in a particular seat. And so they passed the policy requiring districts to assess student proficiency in order to receive credit for graduation. As a result of this, districts really began to have conversations about how to develop course level competencies. They began to have discussions about how to identify appropriate assessment methods. They began to have conversations about how to develop pathways for students to earn a diploma, different pathways depending on the student's interests and learning needs. And then as a state, they came together and they began efforts to try to redesign their pre-service and professional development system, all in an effort to live out this vision to shift to a competency-based approach to teaching and learning. Well, in 2011, the federal government enters this conversation, announcing that states throughout the country would have the opportunity to apply for a waiver from the No Child Left Behind accountability requirements. It took until June of 2013 for New Hampshire to get approved. And what New Hampshire received, what they were eventually approved on, was not quite the vision that they hoped to execute in their state. So as a result, the state is continuing to build two accountability systems, one that supports the vision that the federal government has laid on the table, and one that supports the vision that they are growing and owning locally in communities across the state. So New Hampshire will have an opportunity, as will other states, to apply for renewal of their waiver. They, again, are charging ahead, hoping that they can put an alternate vision on the table for renewal that'll get them a step farther to the true vision that they want to live out. The bullets that you see on your slide there are elements of the vision that they are currently talking to their stakeholders in the state about. So they would like to have districts, really begin to implement local performance assessments in exchange for greater autonomy in identifying their accountability indicators and measures. So they would tell states that you could develop your own measures for accountability, but that they had to cover at least 4 domains: academic, college and career readiness, teacher effectiveness, and school environment. They would require districts to still administer a state summative assessment at a minimum in grades 4, 8, and at least once in high school. This would be in contrast to an annual summative assessment. But they would still have these 3 testing windows to ensure some level of comparability in the system. They would still require districts to establish annual measurable targets for accountability purposes. They would require districts to demonstrate a clear vision and the capacity for high-quality execution, with a particular emphasis on educator preparation and a plan to ensure equity and excellence of the system. And lastly, they're entertaining the idea of developing a locally developed performance assessment pilot for high schools so that they can begin to measure some of these deeper indicators identified in the 4 domains mentioned earlier. So the New Hampshire case study is really the perfect example of a state with a vision to advance competency education, but there are sort of clear federal barriers that are standing in the way of the state from doing so. You know, I think in a perfect world, New Hampshire would be able to move forward and implement their vision to fidelity. Instead, they're having to, you know, sort of fight incrementally with the federal government to get pieces of their vision approved. So what are some of the accountability measures that they are really running up against? So the first is that the federal time-based accountability policies really fail to emphasize this continuous improvement of student learning that we see is so integral to competency-based education. The federal law requires states to set annual measurable objectives, so these annual indicators, again, these annual goals, and this emphasis on kind of end-of-the-year data collection is really making it difficult to customize instruction. The second barrier there is that the federal law really doesn't provide enough flexibility for the use of multiple measures. This is something that Susan raised earlier in the chat box there. You know, right now the emphasis is on math and English language arts and graduation rates, all very important things, but it really doesn't get at sort of a broader view of success that we think is important in competency-based classrooms. The third is that federal accountability indicators do not measure student progress toward mastery of competencies aligned to standards. So the federal waiver process did permit states to incorporate student growth data, but it's not something that's been codified in federal law. And, you know, it hasn't been implemented quite to the level that we would hope it would be implemented in a competency-based system. So it's important to know if a student's made 1 year's growth, but if the student is 3-4 years behind, it really isn't that helpful to know that a student just keeps making 1 year's growth. We want to see that student catch up. And then the fourth barrier that we identified is the federal requirements regarding annual classification of schools and districts for improvement can inhibit continuous improvement. Again, if everyone's focused on, you know, annual test results, where those annual test results place schools in annual rankings, that's not really helping drive real-time supports and interventions to ensure that problems are corrected before they escalate. So as we think about how to address these barriers, there's a number of big questions that really arise. What types of indicators and measures are necessary to track student progress through competencies aligned to standards? So we talked a little bit about growth. We think it's really important to be able to measure things like the rate of growth, how quickly are students progressing through learning trajectories. The second indicator that I might offer up there is, you know, we've talked a lot in our work about lifelong learning competencies. So some of the dispositions, behaviors, lifelong learning competencies, whatever word you want to use, things like grit and perseverance that we know are important skills to see students persist and graduate. How do we measure those and incorporate those into a system? The second question we have there, what types of indicators and measures should trigger federally required supports and interventions? When should these occur? So what are additional measures needed to do a deeper diagnostic of what's happening in schools? And if we move away from a time-based system, when do these types of supports and interventions, when do they occur? The third, what changes in reporting are needed to better communicate student progress so that stakeholders will focus on the continuous improvement of learning for all students? So we know that annual scores are really not motivating. Annual reporting is really not motivating the change we want to see in our classrooms. What would? And the last, how could the accountability system account for competency-based elements such as shift from traditional levels? So right now, we see transition points, middle to high school to college. Well, what would that look like if we were moving students along individual learning trajectories that might take into account learning progressions instead of grade levels? So as we tackled and thought a lot about some of these questions, we came up with the following recommendations that you can see there on your screen as sort of immediate next steps for policymakers in Washington. The first was the idea that we really need to provide some flexibility to let states begin to explore the creation of statewide competency-based systems. So the federal government allowing states to develop a pilot program to support this work for states to be able to design their own accountability systems. It takes into account multiple measures at multiple points within a year. We also think it's critically important that any kind of pilot program that happens, that there's an aligned national evaluation so that we can learn from the investments that we're making in this area. So we want to know what kind of impact these new structures have on student academic achievement, college readiness, college access and matriculation, and employment outcomes. The third, simply just requesting a study of all the time-based federal policies and regulations that are in statute or in the regulatory process, and really developing a plan to eliminate or replace these policies. You can only imagine, I'm sure, how many reporting challenges exist as a result of federal time-based reporting requirements. And then the fourth is to require states to have a plan in place to really ensure that student progress is identified in real time and to ensure that all students receive supports and interventions when they need it. We want to make sure that this emphasis on real time becomes part of the way every federal policymaker thinks when they're developing policy. We want to make sure that implementation happens when students need the support, as opposed to along an annual cycle. So that's really a quick overview of kind of one section of this paper. As a reminder, our goal of this paper was really to jumpstart a national dialogue about the proper federal role in supporting the growth of competency education. We see these policy recommendations as a starting point, and it's our intention to work with stakeholders throughout DC, throughout the country over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, however long it takes, to really refine this list and add more specific details to some of these recommendations. So with that, I will turn it back over and we can take some questions.
Great, thank you, Lillian. So I see one question that's come in, and please feel free to whether it's a question or a reflection or an opinion, please feel free to type that into your chat box. We wanted to leave a good amount of time for the discussion, so feel free to contribute. So there's a question from Bob Sorensen. Why do you suppose most competency-based learning plans emphasize secondary level learning? We all know the crucial importance of the early learning phase, and this may be the most important place for us to develop the model of students learning essential skills to complete competency. Lillian, do you want to take a crack at that? Okay, sorry, I had to digest for a second.
It's a great question. You know, I think when we think about a new system, we think about tackling K-12 because that's the way the federal government has structured their law. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act takes on K-12, and then early learning is dealt with separately. That said, even within the K-12 space, you do see a lot of emphasis on this secondary element. I think competency-based education, when you look at the implementation of the model, it works very well in high school settings. It lends itself to rich, project-based learning, lots of multiple pathway options where, students are maybe doing rigorous work-based internship opportunities aligned to the competencies they need to master. They may be taking, online courses structured on their own time. They may be taking, they may be working in, with community members on extended learning opportunities, maybe even using badging, for example, for credits. So I think that it's sometimes a little bit harder to see implementation of a competency system in an elementary environment. That's not to say that we haven't seen it done and done well. And so I think as we message this, we need to think systemically about how to make this work. We certainly, will probably, as we talk to policymakers in Washington, our starting point will be reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so our emphasis will be on looking at the K-12 system, but I think it's an important point and one that, we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lillian. And as you were talking, I also was thinking that it would be helpful to highlight one of the case studies in the report, which is on page 25 of the report, about a competency-based turnaround that's going on in Detroit through their educational, their EAA, the Educational Achievement Authority of Michigan, which is the special school district that was created for bottom 5% lowest performing schools in the state. So 2 of those schools, which are actually K-8 schools, have been using a competency-based blended learning model with the initial data is pretty spectacular. In talking to local educators and superintendents and teachers, one of the big challenges of implementing competency education is in articulating that link between the competencies and the standards and building out the assessments. And depending on who you talk to, the standard is the competency, or the competency is built out one level down from the standard, and there may also be learning objectives that follow. So it's really about what works in that school as they're articulating these things and aligning assessments. But as Susan Patrick pointed out in the comments, it's the high school level focus, I think, has really been driven by the conversation about Carnegie units and the units that you need towards graduation. But if you are back mapping from your college and career readiness down to kindergarten, it is possible, and we should have more conversations about how educators are building out and articulating those competencies. All right, let's see. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in here, which is great. Let's see. Okay, so Adriana says states such as Maine and New Hampshire are actively working to engage higher education stakeholders to look into 2 key items: the admissions process and teacher prep. And that was actually in response to a question from Jim Bogdan, which is, it's hard to imagine a world without Carnegie units. How do higher education admissions offices deal with alternate types of transcripts? I'd actually love to turn that question over to Chris Sturgis, if Chris is willing and able to do that. Chris just published last month another competency works issue brief called Progress and Proficiency, Redesigning Grading for Competency Education. Chris, could you click your talk button and address that?
Hi, can you guys hear me? I'm not set up for this.
Can hear you great.
Oh, great. Okay. So for higher ed, I was just writing Jim a long note. the higher ed route to competency education is a very different one than K-12. They're in a different place. There's different dynamics, and it's being driven by different things. In K-12, it's really driven around equity and higher achievement. In K-12, the issue around cost is driving a lot of those conversations. In higher ed, they also have a number of different types of institutions, and when you look at where there's industry-based skills, it's much easier to convert to a competency ed system. The big challenge is around the BAs, which, what is the goal of a BA is very unclear. And so there's some universities that are starting to do a tuning process. For example, they take all their physics, University of Utah is taking their physics professors and starting to try to say, what is it we expect our students to be able to do, know and do by the time they graduate with a degree in physics. So they're going through the same process, but they don't have the Common Core. They haven't done the work on standards. We stay in touch with the folks from higher ed, but it's a very different look at it. In terms of at high schools, how to operate without the Carnegie unit, at this point, most of the high schools just say we're taking courses and then we're going to define what those competencies are within that course. And there's a lot of places that maintain a credit system, which is fine. But we're starting to see, and I know Steve Koski's on here and he could talk about it, we're starting to see people start to say, well, what if we weren't just thinking about the credits? What if we really stayed focused on the learning progressions and the competencies we want? How might that then start to take us down a different path about how we construct schools? Those are folks pushing the limit about how we're, I should say pushing the envelope, because we don't know what the limit is. But we definitely believe that credits are a valuable organizing tool, but certainly not always essential. I hope that's helpful.
This is Lillian. If I could add to that, something comes to mind, a conversation that I had on a trip to Maine recently, where we sort of asked the question, well, where's the biggest pushback to these competency education models coming from? And interestingly enough, the answer was sometimes it's the parents of high school students that are really worried about the college admissions process. And Maine found this, and Maine decided to tackle this by getting their public institutions to come together and essentially sign a public letter to the community saying that we see the rigor of competency-based learning environments just as important and just as rigorous as traditional environments. And as college admissions officials, we essentially, they didn't say it this way, but we essentially are intelligent enough to know the difference and to know what a student is prepared to do when they enter our institution. So they're finding that it's really just about messaging this differently than necessarily the hard nitty-gritty questions of how to compare one student to another.
Okay. There's a question from, and you guys are just lighting up the chat box. I'm having a hard time keeping up. Thank you. This is great discussion. So there's a question from Pat Laystrom. Of the states that are further ahead with competency education policies, are there examples of speak-to-teacher assessments, and I assume by that, Pat, you mean teacher-developed assessments, being used to show proficiency and be accepted for accountability purposes? Well, the short answer to that in the federal context is no. In terms of state accountability outside of the meeting federal reporting requirements, I don't have an answer to that. If anyone does, please feel free to jump in. I mean, the challenge with the assessments that are used for federal accountability purposes, and will continue to be a challenge as we go down this road, is if we want to maintain equity in the system, there needs to be ultimately some validation of the measures that are being used. You cannot compare, you cannot aggregate apples with oranges. So even if the assessments themselves are developed by different individuals, they need to be valid and aligned to the same competencies and standards. So I think as we move forward with this work, it's going to require some major investment in not only assessments, but the learning metrics behind assessments. We have another long string of thinking which didn't make it into the paper just because it added too much complexity, but we'll probably be doing some thinking on at a later date about the role that government plays in research and development in this space, and the investments that need to be made. So that's a great question, and I think as we have this conversation, we do need to think about how we can empower teachers to develop assessments that could ultimately roll up for accountability purposes, but we're not there yet.
Maria, I'll add, when you sort of think about the different layers of assessments, there are a number of states that are looking at either are already implementing or are in the development process of implementing statewide performance-based assessments. That the hope is that they'll be able to integrate those into their accountability systems. And these performance-based assessments, in theory, would be able to really measure a deeper level of learning than some of the statewide summative kind of pen and paper tests that we've traditionally seen. So that's a very promising movement that we're tracking very closely. There are also, as I mentioned in the New Hampshire example, there's obviously some interest in developing local performance-based assessments to assess student mastery of competencies. I would imagine that, in theory, some of these could be teacher developed. I don't want to put words in New Hampshire's mouth, but based on some conversations I've had with them, I think that they're looking at some of the comparability challenges of those assessments by seeing if they can create like a state item bank for test items, and that they could allow locals to have the flexibility to select their own items and design their own assessments, but within a comparable state item bank. So I think states and districts are trying to think creatively about how to get at the issue of flexibility versus comparability.
So there was an earlier clarification to Bob Sorensen's question about earlier level definition of competencies, and he says the clarification to my question is that early childhood includes K-3 as well as preschool. So this question does apply to the ESEA reauthorization, but also to preschool and Head Start discussions. I think that's right. I mean, the prevailing wisdom in the federal policy discussion is that what gets measured gets taught. And because there are no federal accountability student achievement metrics required to be collected in pre-K, nor would I think the consensus be, should we do that? I mean, some might disagree with that, but do we want to be testing students in pre-K for federal accountability purposes? So the question is really, how can we reframe our accountability systems so it's not just driving behaviors that are related to the exact things that are being measured, but it's driving behavior of the system to assisting students where they are. And so if that means that a student is coming into pre-K and they are behind on their pre-literacy skills, then there would be, I think that would be a great discussion to have in a Head Start reauthorization about how the system could do a better job of driving that to the right kids. I think right now the resources are driven based on poverty, which is, research would suggest that is the right way to drive it. But then the next question is where, in envisioning a high quality early education system, thinking about competencies, what does that look like in the early education area? So that's a great point, Bob. Let me look at some other questions that have come in.
Maria,
So there's been some
Oh,
more.
sorry. I was just going to say I see a question that popped in about, the question is, would these diplomas work with standardized tests such as PARCC or Smart or Balanced? And that sort of, I think, brings up an important point. You know, a lot of people have asked questions about, you know, sort of where the assessment consortia, the PARCC and the Smart or Balanced assessment consortia, the products that they're developing, would those even work within a competency-based system? And I think the general consensus, and I'm not an assessment expert by any stretch of imagination, but the general consensus is that the tests themselves, they are a significant improvement over the tests that were currently being used by states, but they do not go deep enough to really cover the depth of learning that we're talking about in a competency-based system, so that there would need to be some additional work done to those assessments, or at least an effort by states to package maybe that particular assessment along with others to cover the full range of knowledge that we're looking for students to acquire. And so, you know, there's an interesting conversation, I think, that's going to happen at the state and potentially the federal level about where, you know, how much this is going to cost, what types of assessments need to be developed, and, you know, quite frankly, do we have enough assessments already in play right now that we can roll up data from the local level to inform these state-based accountability conversations?
Okay, I see that Susan Patrick has her hand up. Susan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on Lillian's last comments that I think when you are looking at the PARCC and Smart or Balanced, if you think of those assessments being designed along the learning trajectory or continuum, that they could be broken up and used as, there's a term that's used in international education on moderating assessments, and that's a different word than summative, but it's the same idea. What moderating assessments are, they are summative assessments that moderate or validate the data on the ground. And if you think of these systems, plural, of assessments, where the summative assessment's real purpose would be to moderate or validate that data on the ground, then you could picture a much more robust system that would tie in the learning in the classroom to help inform accountability and bring alignment between a student-centered learning system and what would be a robust student-centered accountability system. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Well, we have unfortunately come to the end of our time. I want to just provide you with my contact information and Lillian's contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any other questions. We today only had time, you know, within the given time to go deeply into the accountability system, but we are trying to determine if there's an appetite out there for us to go more deeply into the assessments, the data systems, and the supports and interventions. So if you think that would be a valuable topic for further webinars, please just, you know, either say so in the comments right now or reach out to us. We're really excited to have such great engagement in the chat today. Really appreciate your questions and your comments, and we look forward to further engaging you on this topic in the future. So thank you very much. Lillian, I'll just hand it over to you also for any last words.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank everyone for their time. This is going to be a long conversation, so we hope to engage all of you in the future going forward. We have a lot to learn from everybody working in the trenches, so please don't hesitate to stay in contact with us and engage and help us further our thinking.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for attending today, and please stay in touch. Have a nice day.